Okay, so this tutorial is going to walk you through the basics of After Effects, and it's not really going to cover much in the way of specific effects. We'll have some later tutorials and lessons that will do that. But this is really just to quickly familiarize you with the program and some of the basics of using it and kind of how it's laid out so that you can get going on exercises and other projects using it. So this is your basic interface you'll see here. This is our main preview window where we'll be able to see what we're doing. You have some side tabs over here where we'll find effects and such, timeline down here, and project window over here. In a lot of ways, if you're familiar with any other Adobe products like Photoshop or Illustrator or particularly Adobe Premiere, this is going to look very similar and work very much the same way in terms of at least the layout aspects of it. So when we open up After Effects for the first time, it'll kind of default bring us into a new project. If it doesn't bring you into that and there's some other project, you can always just go new project here. And it's only going to have one project open at a time. So if there was some other project and I do that, it's going to close the previous one I had in there. So the first thing we want to do is bring in some assets, which are in After Effects, different things to work with that are pre-existing, that are coming from somewhere else, whether that's from another Adobe program or from elsewhere. You can shortcut to input some footage, Command I, or if you want to look for it in the menu, it is Import File. And there's an option to select multiple files, which you can do and select things from different places. But the file one, just selecting that, will allow you to select multiple files from the same place. So let's say I want these 3 footage files here. So I'm just going to open up that. And there they are, and they show up here in my project window. And if I click on any of them, I can see some information about it, the resolution, a little preview of it. I can see these clips have some audio, color space, the codec, frame rate, all this good sort of stuff that we want to know in post-production if we're trying to figure out where something came from. And so now I have some footage in here that I can do something with. And when we're working in After Effects, we're basically always working in what's called a composition. And you'll see actually sort of the default here is new composition. And if I click on that, or if I click this little icon here, is the same thing. Or lastly, if I go up to the menu and new composition, you can see the shortcuts also Command N. It'll bring up a window and let me choose some information about this. So I can choose my aspect ratio, resolution, pixel aspect ratio actually as well, frame rate, how long it is, give it a name, all sorts of great stuff. So if I'm creating something from scratch, I have a lot of choices here. And if I'm working in a project and creating something from scratch for a larger project, I can use this to make sure that everything matches to the format of that project so that I have the right frame rate and resolution and everything so it'll fit in nicely. Most of the time, I don't actually use this window because if I have footage that's from that project, what I want to do most of the time is actually just match that footage in terms of the resolution and aspect ratio and frame rate and everything, keep everything consistent. So the one way I can do that is to take this and drag it down into the new composition icon here. And you'll see what it does is creates a new composition, showed up down here in my timeline. That's where I can see a composition. And a composition is very much like your timeline in Premiere. And you'll also see up here in my project window, it created a composition with the name of that. Now the nice thing when I did this, if I go to my composition settings, you'll see it automatically defaulted all of these to match the settings of that clip. So whatever footage I brought in, it's auto gonna work with all of that, which is nice. I could change the name of this and say this is billboard composition. That's what I want to call it. And you notice things just start to stack up here. Now in a larger project where you might have a lot of assets and a lot of compositions, things can start to get busy really quickly. So I would recommend doing some sort of organization here. For instance, I can create a folder down here and I'll say this is just my footage. And so I'm going to take those and grab these footage clips and just drag them in there. And they're still there. I can still work with them the same way. It just makes things a little more organized for me. Okay, so what happened over here, you'll notice this composition is selected and it opened into this window. And a couple settings down here I want to draw our attention to at this point. We'll look at some others later on. First is just the magnification, so I can choose kind of how blown up this image is. If I want to see it like pixel for pixel, I could go to 100%. A really nice one to use is fit, so that'll just make sure that whatever clip this is, if it's standard def or 4K or 8K or HD or whatever, it'll kind of zoom it to fit in this window so I can see the whole shot, which is nice. The other thing here that I'll point out at the moment is this thing, which is basically the playback resolution as it's trying to watch things in here. And this is something where if I'm working on a nice high-powered system and want to just leave this at full, great. If I'm working on my laptop and doing some complicated stuff, I might want to lower the resolution on this. And you'll notice right now it doesn't really seem like it got much lower. If we go back, you can see there's full, there's quarter. You can see things get a little pixelated-y there. But I can do all my work at a lower resolution if I need to, if I'm not doing something that's sort of pixel specific. And that'll just make it kind of run a little smoother when I'm looking at things in here and moving around. And then I can always go make sure I go back to full resolution to actually output anything and to look at sort of final things. So that's what that is for that. This preview window is also where I'm going to look at other things. So right now I'm looking at this composition. Let's say instead I wanted to look at this layer. So right now this is the only layer in the composition. So you know what, let's go ahead and throw another layer in here. You'll notice this looks a lot like the layer menu that would be over here in Photoshop, where I can kind of layer things on top of each other. Actually, let's put in 2 different clips so you can just see these. And just like in Photoshop, things that are on the top are kind of in front of other things. So this clip here is what we're looking at right now. It's in front of this one so we can't see it. If I turn off the little eye icon, now that clip on top goes away and we can see the thing below it. And now we see nothing. If I turn on or off this one while the other one's on, it doesn't change anything because this other one is still on top of it, so we wouldn't be able to see it anyway. Okay, so I got my 2 layers in this composition. So these are called layers. And let's say I wanted to do something specific to this layer. And there are certainly things I can do to work with a layer within the composition, but sometimes there are things where I need to actually kind of open up that layer and work in it. So I can just double click on it, and it comes up here in the composition, or sorry, it comes up here in the preview window. It's the version of this from the composition. And you'll notice here it says it's a layer, and so it's that layer inside that composition. And there are some things in After Effects where it's going to matter whether you're looking at the composition itself or a layer within it. You notice right now both of these kind of look the same. They're showing the same thing. So I'm just mentioning that because you want to be careful what you're working on and make sure you're looking at the right thing. I've definitely had instances where I was trying to do something in a layer and wasn't paying attention and was actually looking at the composition, or vice versa. So just make sure you're aware of those. And I can have multiple things kind of available in the preview here, kind of open at once. If I want to open up that layer instead, now it's still this composition and this layer, and I can switch between them. And you notice on this one, even though I still have the little eyeball turned on here on the composition, I opened up this layer, so even though it's on the bottom and in the composition, it's blocked by something else, I can see that layer because I'm looking at the layer itself, not the finished composition. Okay, so let's go back to our sort of main view here. Down here in the timeline, you can see I can scroll through and kind of see what this clip looks like. And right now there's it's the shortish composition. If I want the composition to be longer, I could go into my composition settings and say, hey, instead of this composition being 24 seconds, let's make it 50 seconds. And the composition just got longer. And I can use my little zoom tools down here and see now I have this whole composition after the clips end. So you can see kind of the length of my clips here. Here's my zoom tools, by the way. You can zoom all the way into a single frame and kind of all the way out. While I'm thinking of moving in the timeline, just a handy shortcut to point out, if you hold down Command and do left and right, that's moving me frame by frame. If I zoom in here a little more, we can see this better. So moving frame by frame forward is to the right, backwards to the left. And that's just a quick way to move around. Similarly, if you hold down Command and do the up and down arrows, it'll switch you between kind of what layer you are looking at, or what layer you have selected or focused at that point. Okay, so while I have this out in the timeline here, the thing I wanted to note is After Effects is working in sort of time-based media, so these clips take place over time, and I can work with them within that. So I could take this and sort of move it here, and now what we would see, just like in Premiere, this is going to kind of play waterfall top down, so it'll go from the top, there's nothing there, so it plays the clip below it until we get to this point, and here we cut right there. So now we're playing the top clip, even though there's something going on beneath it, because as soon as there's something on top, it'll play it. And you'll notice you could actually use this. I would definitely not advise it, but you could use After Effects for editing. You can bring in footage and line things up and lay out clip by clip by clip. It would get very obnoxious and unwieldy pretty quickly, because one of the things you'll notice is each layer kind of ends up, or each piece of footage that I'm using ends up as its own layer. And actually, if I wanted to use another part of this clip later, there's ways I can sometimes do it depending on exactly what part I wanted to use and what it was doing, where it might be on one layer, but most of the time it would probably end up on a second layer. And so you just would get a stack for basically every time you had a cut, you'd get another layer stacked in here, and this would get really obnoxious. But you can do some basic editing in here. That sort of functionality is part of this. Another thing I note while I have this, if I get to the end of a clip, I can sort of trim it in or out for what part of that clip I want to use. And something I like about this interface is it does show me here the kind of whole length of the clip, so I know what part of it I'm using and if there's more clip available to me or not. I can still take this and kind of move it around, and now we won't see that clip till we get to the parts that we sort of have selected that we want to use. And even though there was some of that clip here, I've trimmed it down so we're not seeing it. Also, while we're here, there's this thing at the top called the work area, and see, I can kind of move this in and out, and I can work outside the work area. So I could move this here and I can still go here and sort of see what I'm looking for. The convenience for this is when I'm going to, there'll be some ways that we can make my view kind of jump to that a little easier. But when I go to output things, the default is going to be to output the work area. So I can kind of select just a segment of something that I want to output or work in. And the ways to quickly adjust your work area are the B as in boy and N as in nest keys. So if I want my work area to end here, I'll hit N for end. I know end starts with an E, but work with me. And if I want to start here, I can hit B for beginning, and that makes my work area go there. I have similar some shortcuts that can be handy on a layer. If I want to sort of chop off the beginning part of this and just this layer to start here, I can do Option and left bracket, kind of chops the clip to start at that point. You'll notice it didn't move anything. I just trimmed this down to where my cursor is. And let's say I wanted that clip to end here. I can do Option right bracket, and that'll sort of trim it to go right there. It does matter which layer I have selected. You'll notice I was working on this bottom one, so it left this top one alone. If I had this one selected and did the same thing, now that one got trimmed down to there. Okay, so that's sort of how I can basically just sort of move things around within a composition. And you'll see your composition is really your equivalent of a sequence in Premiere or your timeline or whatever you want to call it. Okay, so let's look at a couple other things within each of these layers in terms of just the basics of working with After Effects, which remember is our goal here today. You'll see by each of these I have a drop down box or drop down arrow, so I can drop this down and see some different properties of it. Now right now all I have is this transform one and audio. If there was no audio, the audio wouldn't show up. If I have some other effects or other things on this, I could get more options showing up here. So it will not always just look like this, because it'll depend what things I've done with that clip, what other things I might have accessible there. But my basic one I'll have showing up on pretty much everything is my transform controls. And I have a anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. And so I can adjust these things. Let's say I wanted, let's do real simple. I'll change the opacity. So 100% opacity means something's completely visible. If I go down to 0% opacity, it means something's completely see-through. If I go somewhere in between, you'll see now I'm sort of partially seeing through the original clip to this clip below it. And same thing with any of these, the rest of these, if I want to rotate or scale or anything like that, if I make this bigger, I can scale it up. And if I want to rotate it for Lord knows why, I could do that. And if I want to move it around, I can adjust the position. Position and anchor point, I'm going to just note, this is my anchor point in this case, and you'll notice when I rotate it, it rotates it around that anchor point. If I move the anchor point to somewhere else, you'll notice it's kind of moving the clip with it at the moment. But now it is rotating it around that new anchor point. So you'll see now it's kind of spinning around there instead of spinning around the center of the clip. So just something to watch for is when you're moving something, are you moving the anchor point or the position? Because there are cases in which that'll make a difference. So the position is kind of moving the whole clip, anchor point and everything. And moving the anchor point, you can see I'm leaving, when I'm adjusting this, when I'm adjusting this, the clip is kind of moving around the anchor point, but the anchor point is staying in the same spot. You can see it right here. You can see the clip is moving around it, whereas when I move the position, I'm moving the clip and the anchor point together. Okay, so we've done whatever we have now done with this clip. That's how we can move things around there. This is also where I'll get into my keyframing, is in these sort of drop-down menus. So let's try something really simple and just say I wanted this clip. Let me bring a little of this back. I wanted this clip to sort of start visible and fade out. So I'm going to start at an opacity of 100, and I want it to go down to an opacity of 0. So by default, these things are going to come in with their keyframing off. So I'm going to click on that, and it turns on the keyframing, and you'll see I get this little diamond here. And a diamond is a keyframe in After Effects. And remember, just like in any other software you've used, the idea of a keyframe is just anything that's going to change over time. And I'm always going to need at least two, because I need one to tell it where it is at one point and a second one to tell it what it is changing to. So one keyframe never really accomplishes anything, because it's just saying, okay, it's at this point right now, and it's going to stay at that point forever after that, and it was at that point forever before it. But now that I've got my keyframing turned on, which is this little stopwatch here, I could make another keyframe here. And I could do that by clicking this little dot, and it made a keyframe there. Or if I'm at this place, and this is a property, the opacity in this case, that I've already turned on keyframes, then if I just adjust this, it's going to say, oh, if there's going to be an adjustment at a different location, I need a keyframe. So it'll sort of auto-create one there. You can see now what we've done is the shot starts all the way in and sort of fades out to nothingness, and we can see the other clip behind it here. I'll stretch this out a little bit. And then we see the other clip behind it again. So that's the idea of keyframes, and it's very simple. And there are a lot of things you can do with keyframes. There are a lot of things we're going to do. There are things in After Effects that you do that are not just sort of keyframing every single thing. There's some other effects that are generators and stuff like that. But a lot of things do come down to, at some level, keyframing things to change over time. And so, here's a simple one, is just the fade out. We could make something change in scale or position and move around or rotate or whatever. And as we get further, we'll see some more complicated things. But that's the basics. And anything you have to keyframe, this is kind of one way you can go in and do that. If I accidentally created a keyframe I didn't want, so let's just say there's a keyframe here and I don't actually want that one, I can kind of go here and right click on it, and you'll see different keyframe options. But kind of the default way to do this is I go right on top of that keyframe. If I want to make sure I'm on it, I can jump using these arrows to jump between keyframes for that property. Each different property can have its own keyframe. So here it means keyframes for that. So if I jump forward on this one, I can go to there, but you'll notice I can't jump forward on this one because I'm already past my last keyframe. So I can kind of jump to those and then just click that little blue dot, and then I'll get rid of that one there. And I can move these in the timeline. For instance, if I want the scale change to also match the opacity change in timing, I can sort of do that like that. So that's the idea of my basic keyframes. And then I can sort of hide these things down. And one of the things you'll note, and there's some keyboard shortcuts for this, is you do often need to get into these properties, and then that sort of starts to take up more and more real estate as you open up different layers. So then you'll kind of collapse some things. I find I end up spending a lot of time in After Effects kind of collapsing and uncollapsing things to get to where I want to do and be able to see the different layers I'm working with and what I'm trying to accomplish at any given time. Okay, so a couple other After Effects basics things. I have some tools up here that some of those we'll be encountering in some other lessons, particularly when we get into masking. But one to add right off the bat is just titling. So I can select the title tool here and go into my composition somewhere and type something. And you notice as soon as I started typing, it created that as a new layer. And so just like anything else in my composition, that comes in as a layer, and I can work with it the same way. So I can shrink it down if I only want the title to be part of my video for that long. I could do that. By the way, I could accomplish the same thing by going in here and saying, okay, so I want it to play until here. And at that point, it's 100% opacity. And then if I just really want it to disappear, I can go one frame forward and make it 0% opacity. And you can see just a quick change that I did via keyframing, and that really accomplished exactly the same thing as if I would have just taken this and shrunk it down there. It's back where it was. You'll notice as I move this, any keyframes that are attached to it are moving with it in time. So when I move this around, those keyframes here stick with that layer. You also notice, because this is text, I have some different options here that was not in these footage options. And that's some things with the text. So I can change what's happening with my text. And you can see some things about the fill and the bleeding and the path. I could actually even keyframe something about the short text, about the text itself, and make that change. So if I did something like that, at that point the text changes. And this is a little different than most of our keyframing, where it's going to sort of gradually shift from one to the other. In this case, since it is literally just different text, it's just going to sort of switch from one to the other. Okay, but so that's why I can put in a text. Once I put in text, I have all the same controls as I would for anything else. So if I want the text to sort of spin around, I can do that. You can see it spinning around the anchor point there. And if I were to move the anchor point to, let's say the corner of it, and then rotate it, it's again going to spin around where that anchor point is, so I can get the rotation to look very different. If I move my anchor point way over here, now it's kind of moving about that, and you can tell it's moving around something far away from itself instead of moving around the center like it was before. And actually, if I wanted to sort of literally kind of spin in place, I could do something like that. And I could keyframe all that if I really wanted to. Okay, and so now as this plays, it's going to spin around there. Okay, so that's basics of adding text. And there are some text controls over here also, I should point out. All your usual sort of stuff you would expect in any text aspects within the Adobe suite. All works pretty similarly. All right, let's talk about what if I want to bring something in from another program, because one of the kind of neat things within the Adobe suite is their dynamic linking, and this means A, that I can bring things from one program into another, and B, that when they're in there, it's not like just a sort of a static reference to it. I can update things in one and it'll affect the other. I will say there's times where I'm really careful about using that because it can get you sometimes into trouble if you're expecting something to update one way or you're doing something and don't realize another program's also referencing it. But it is a cool ability. So let's take a quick look at this. So I'm going to go into just Photoshop here and let's make something our standard HD 1920 by 1080 resolution. And I'm just going to make a couple of layers in here. So that we can see kind of how this, how this works once we get into, let's do one more text layer. Sure, why not? Well, let's do something different at least there, different color. Okay. To show you kind of how these work once we get into After Effects. So here I have a couple of text layers, a couple of lines, and I have this background layer. So when you see this sort of grid thing in Photoshop, that means it's transparent. If I have that background in there, it's not transparent. It's actually sort of a giant white rectangle. And let's save this. And I'm just going to save it on my desktop here and say temp Photoshop doc for demo. Okay. And now I'm going to go into After Effects and bring that in. And first thing you're going to notice is when I go to do this, I have a couple options here. I can import it as footage, which is what I did before, or composition, retain layer sizes, or composition. So first I'm going to bring it in as footage, which is probably not normally what I would want to do with a Photoshop document, but just to kind of show you what that ends up doing. Okay. So I have a choice of either merging the layers or choosing a particular layer to bring in. I'm going to say let's just merge them. And so now I have something that I can bring in here, and it's another layer. I can put it wherever I want. And there we go. And you can see here what I was talking about, how After Effects will play the top layer first. So here's that title. You can see it's over the Photoshop document, but the Photoshop document is over the footage, so we're not seeing the footage. And you'll notice that it really just brought this in as a piece of footage. So all that stuff is sort of baked in together and going to be handled together. That's fine, but I kind of lose a little bit of the advantage of doing this separately in Photoshop or Illustrator, you know, where I have some more control over certain types of things that I'm doing, right? All these programs can actually do a lot of the same things. It's choosing what's going to be the best program and give you the best choices for kind of the specific thing you're trying to do. So for instance, there are some sort of visual effectsy things that you can do in Photoshop that are the same as what you can do in After Effects. There are some things that each of them can do that the other one can't as well. But for most of those visual effects on moving footage sort of thing, I'd probably rather do it in After Effects because most of them tend to be easier to do in After Effects and I get a little more control over it, even though Photoshop can do them. So same thing here. If I really just wanted to, you know, make a few little things like this, I could just do it in After Effects rather than going into another program and doing this. Now let's go ahead and take this out. So I'm just going to highlight the layer and delete that. I can go ahead and leave the footage in here. Go back into my import window and bring this in. And this time I'm going to say I want to bring it in as a composition. Okay, and doing it with editable layer styles. Okay, so two things I want to point out here. First is it actually did bring it in as a composition. So I have a new composition in my project that I didn't before that has the same name as that Photoshop doc. And if I open it up, it looks like a composition. You can see each of those layers. So now I have individual control over each of those for what I want to do with them. And you also see it created this folder. I'm going to delete this. This was the one I brought in before when I brought it in as footage, which wasn't really what I said we'd want to do, just so we don't confuse ourselves. So it created this folder that has all the individual layers from that document. So now if I want to use just one of those layers somewhere, I can grab them individually, or I could grab them out of here. And I have this composition. So now, if I wanted to go back into my original composition here, notice these are both open. I can have multiple compositions open as long as they're part of the same project. So if I change projects, for instance, if I said I want to go to a new project, it's going to ask if I want to save this because I'm going to have to close it to do that. And I probably should have saved this project because I don't like having something still called untitled project in case this crashes or whatever. So let's go ahead and save it. And After Effects Basics. There we go. Okay, so go back to this. So I got this composition here. I can put compositions nested inside of another. So I could take this composition and put it in here. And now I kind of have just what I had before, with the difference being that instead of this being kind of baked in footage, it's actually this nested composition. Now if I go into that composition and say, you know, I don't really want that white background. I want to leave everything kind of see-through here. Now I go back here and you'll notice immediately it updates this other composition, because now in this composition here, that again was my Photoshop doc, what it actually has is it has these two text things, it has those two lines, and then it's transparent behind it. So I'm seeing through that to the footage beneath it. You can see those thin little lines here and here. So this gives me a lot more power in terms of taking that Photoshop document, and if I want to just leave everything as it was, just like when I brought it in this footage, I can just do this, drag the composition in here, and I'm no worse off than I was. I have all the same powers. But this gives me a lot more flexibility in that now if I want to go in and edit any of these individual layers or turn on or off certain layers, you know, let's do that. And then, you know, I say, actually, I want to move this one over here without affecting the rest of the document. And let's make this transparent again. I can do all that and work with it in my new composition and have all that control there. So that's great. I like that. Now, I do want to mention, I talked about just briefly dynamic linking. And what that means is in here, if I go back in here and I edit this Photoshop document, say edited text. Okay. Now when I go into After Effects, you'll notice there's no difference. It hasn't changed anything yet. And that's because I haven't actually saved this. I just am making some changes, but now I'm going to say like, okay, yeah, I'm done with that. Let's go ahead and save it. And I'm not going to do a save as and create a new thing because that will not affect the dynamic linking. But if I save this, I've now changed this original file that After Effects was referencing. And now when I go in here, you'll see it updated this. So my point being, here's an example of a place I like to use this for. Is let's say you're making like some ending credits or opening credits, either way, in After Effects, and you know, putting some effects and things on them and making them look cool and do what you need them to do. Instead of creating those all from scratch and typing in all the effects in After Effects, and then somewhere down the road you're like, oh, actually this other person came on and helped us with some Foley, and I got to go find where did I do Foley and add that in. I could go into Illustrator or Photoshop and create the text for the credits, whether it's, you know, whether I'm doing sort of individual slides or making a long rolling credits or whatever. Create those there, save them. I can go into After Effects, do all of my animation and any effects I'm doing to it, anything like that. And then if I need to make any changes to the text, I don't have to worry about where in a maybe pretty complicated composition that particular bit of text that I wanted to change was. I just go back into that Photoshop or Illustrator file, change it and save it, and immediately is updated. And in After Effects, if I output a new copy of that, it'll have that updated text in it. So that's one way in which this is a really handy sort of thing to do. That's generally the way I do my sort of credit files, is build them in Illustrator and then link those into After Effects. Okay, so let's say we're done. Let's say we've gotten this composition kind of exactly how we wanted. And I know we haven't done a ton to it or done anything particularly interesting or useful, but remember the purpose of this first tutorial was just like the basics of what does After Effects interface look like and how do you use it. And so we're starting with that, and then we'll start building things on top of it. Actually, you know, I'm going to change my mind and add one more thing, because this will be helpful in setting us up for the next lesson. And that's just briefly talking about masking. So I'm going to do a mask on this layer. And masking is basically just choosing a section of an image that you want to use. So here's this image I've got here. This is this layer. And I'm going to select my pen tool. Shortcut is G, which I note just because you kind of think it would be P, but it's not. And what I'm going to do is just draw some points here. And I can draw however many I want until I connect back and close up my loop here. I'm going to click on that first one I made. And you'll see what that did is it made a mask. And so I'm now only going to see the parts of the footage inside that mask. So if I bring this other clip back up, in fact, if I put this in front of it, you'll now see that we always see that sort of piece of the footage and only that piece of the footage. And you also see on this clip now I have another thing that showed up, which is masks. And I could put multiple masks on a clip. Here's my first one that I just did. If I want to see inverted, so like instead of seeing what's inside that shape I drew, I want to see the outside, I could do that. And there are some options here for how the mask combines with other footage that may be in the clip. I'm going to ignore that for now because that gets more complicated than we want to get into. But I do want to real quick point out the feather. And feathering is just making these edges a little softer. So I've opened up this mask and I'm just going to soften it up a little bit so I don't get such hard edges where it comes in and out. And so you can see now instead of this sort of like hard edge shape, you can see it kind of gradually fades in and out around the edges there a little bit. And that's what the feathering did. And that's how you create a mask, is you just use the pen tool, draw a mask, and there you go. And that'll come in handy when we start trying to mask out some objects, which is a very useful in Indian student film After Effects feature when something made it into your shot that you didn't want. Okay, so now let's say that this footage is done, because now it just looks freaking amazing and we're ready to go. I'm just going to make our work area nice and short here just to keep things quick when it outputs, because I want to show you how to output. So I've selected my work area. I'm going to make sure that all the layers that I want are turned on. So like if this layer is turned off here, then it is not going to show up in my render. So I want to make sure anything that I want to be in there is turned on. And I'm also going to make sure over here, if you see these lines, this is kind of like doing basically like whether it's going to render that layer in high res or sort of a lower resolution. I'm just going to leave these all sort of pointing up, which is full quality there. What do they actually call this? Quality and sampling. There we go. We want full quality, which is that sort of upward sloping line. So I got all these on that I want. I'll go there. And what I'm going to do is add to render queue. And there's two ways I can do this. I can do this within Adobe Media Encoder or do it straight out of After Effects, which is using Adobe Media Encoder under the hood, but it's going to just look a little different. I'm going to do this one. You can get to the same options and stuff either way. So I got to add to render queue, and my render queue shows here. And it is important that it's a queue, meaning a line of things, meaning I could put a whole bunch of things in my render queue. If I had a bunch of compositions I needed to export, do this one, go to the other one, keep working on that, put that one in the render queue. And then when I'm kind of like done and don't need to work for a while, then I can start my render queue rendering and creating these files instead of having to wait after this one for it to output and then do my next one and wait for that to output. So this is nice. You can kind of stack a whole bunch of things going in here. Here's what I wanted to point out in the render queue, because it's not intuitively obvious, although it's fairly straightforward, exactly how you change your settings and stuff. And it's basically you just click on these things. So first off, I'm going to click on this, say, where is this outputting to? And I'm going to immediately delete this. So I'll just put it on my desktop. So that's a test render. Okay, so that changed the name there. Output module. I have a drop down so I can kind of see what the details of that are. But if I want to change it, I'm going to need to click on this. And here's where I get all of my output options. So what kind of file format it's going to be in, what kind of codec it's in inside that. And we'll talk more about these. And my color space and all sorts of things. Do I want to output the audio or not? In this case, I don't, because I have no idea what was in that audio and I don't really care about it. Okay, so I set up those output things, then render settings. Most of the time you can just leave these alone. A couple things to note on is this is where you would choose if you want to put on motion blur and how it's doing fields if you're working with interlaced video, which most of the time we're not, so you don't have to worry about that. If you wanted to output something into a different frame rate, and remember I said the default is to output just the work area, that in to out on the gray bar that was at the top of the timeline. I do have the choice. I could instead output the entire composition or set a custom choice in there, but the default is the work area only, so we'll go with that. Okay, so I could do that. I could go back and work on something else and add something else to the render queue. But once I'm ready to output this, I'm going to hit render, and now I'm not going to be able to do anything in After Effects while it's rendering. This is fine. It's basically telling me the particular format that I'm outputting in has a larger color space than the project or composition itself. So basically, like, I'm making the file larger than it needs to be, which is fine. Okay, so this is going to render pretty quick because it's a very short clip and nothing complicated happening. Some renders can take a while depending on what you're doing, so just a warning about that. So that got rendered, and if we go to my desktop, here's that file. And you can see it does everything we put in there, which again, I'm not sure that accomplished anything with those particular things, but it's there. So that's your basics of how After Effects works, how to get things in, move them around, layer them, and get things back out again. And from here on, we'll be taking that sort of basic skill and then trying to do more productive, useful things with it.